Merci. I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank especially our organizers, Professor Gerard Bossois and Philippe Le Gouin, and all the other committee members who helped him create this wonderful program on Jean Monnet. I'm very grateful for the opportunity today to explore with you the Victory Program and Monnet's relationship with Roosevelt, and to share with you my thoughts and a few conclusions about this work and this period. Jean Monnet certainly did play an important role in the creation of the Victory Program during the Second World War. This program, developed in 1941, was designed to stimulate American production of supplies and armaments to aid the Allies. Monnet believed that unless America and the Allies established closer and franker military cooperation and franker military ties, as well as industrial collaboration, Hitler could not be defeated. He even felt that Western civilization was at stake. I argue in this paper that his success was due to many factors, but most importantly to the following. First, his economic and financial and managerial experience before the war proved that he approached economic problems to be solved pragmatically, and he was a problem solver. Secondly, the missions that he accepted and the initiatives that he took himself or stimulated between 1938 and 1940 placed him at the center of policymaking in Washington in 1941, the key year. And his work, thirdly, his work with the American economists Robert Nathan and Stacey May, two extremely able individuals, were established in 1941 the American production requirements for the Victory Program that would ensure Allied victory. Now, Monnet's experience in coordinating Allied economic policies in the First World War made him acutely aware of the experience of the Allied economic policy, of the need to increase America's productive capacity in the Second. Moreover, his personal relationships with French and British and American leaders in positions of power enabled him to enhance his clout and positioned him in a well to lobby for supplies and armaments. Another important factor was his personality. As you all know, he had very great powers of persuasion. And because he had many influential American friends in high places, he moved easily in the center of Washington policymaking and social circles, and that gave him access to power. The assignment from French Prime Minister Daladier placed him in Washington in 1938 and 39, and gave him the opportunity to meet President Roosevelt, and it also forced him to work with Henry Morgenthau, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, and who disliked Monnet and distrusted him. But Monnet always rose to the challenge. He didn't let that stand in his way. Daladier sent Monnet on a secret mission to Washington, diplomatic mission to Washington in October 1938 to discuss with the American President, Theodore Roosevelt, the French government's desire to buy American military aircraft. The American leader agreed, Roosevelt agreed to this request very rapidly because he believed that the expansion of French, British, and American military power was essential to deter Berlin. Now, this diplomatic relation provided Monnet with several important meetings, personal meetings with Roosevelt. In his first meeting, he was accompanied by William Bullitt, the ambassador, a friend of his who had been ambassador to France and who was a close friend of Daladier's. He first met Roosevelt on October 19th, 1938, at Roosevelt's family home in Hyde Park, New York. Seated in his wheelchair, the president extended his hand and warmly welcomed Monnet. He told Monnet that isolation was strong in his country, and his hands were tied legally by the Johnson Act of 1933, which prohibited loans for arms to any country that had failed to pay its World War I dollar debts, which included France. Roosevelt added that to the Neutrality Act of 1935 forbade sales of complete weapons to belligerents. He said, however, that Hitler had to be stopped, and the sales of complete weapons to belligerents he had already instructed his Air Corps for expanded aircraft production. He stated that the Neutrality Act could be circumvented if the French set up assembly plants near Montreal with the Americans shipping parts across the border. This was a plan that had been cooked up in Paris between various individuals and many friends. The president's charm and his intelligence seduced Monnet into believing that this friendly encounter, as a result of this friendly encounter, he had a working relationship with Monnet. I'm sorry. Morgenthau's diary is a very revealing source for comments, Morgenthau's dislike and distrust of Monnet, and it made it difficult for Monnet to work with him because FDR, Roosevelt, had assigned the responsibility for all purchase of supplies and procurement and the task of negotiating the sale of airplanes to France to his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, the only person in the cabinet that he trusted. So the president sent Monnet to Morgenthau, who initially refused to see him. The Treasury Secretary distrusted this Frenchman, whom he believed had questionable German connections. This was because the consulting firm of Monnet and Monnet and Company had worked to preserve the assets of some German subsidiaries in America. Morgenthau also objected to the planes purchase and the reliance, quote, on Canadian factories. He pressed the Frenchman on how he intended to finance them. How could the French produce enough dollars to pay for the planes, he said, which of course he didn't believe they could do. And so when Monnet returned to Paris with a report to Daladier on the talks, and he arrived back in Washington in November, the concrete offer from the French government on his second of 3 missions to Washington. The French wished to buy a lot of aircraft in 1939, 1,000 at that moment, and they increased their, he said, we provided that they met French requirements. Monnet's existence continued to irritate Morgenthau, but it never stopped. And he complained, Morgenthau complained to Bullitt, complained to Bullitt that Monnet, in quotes, doesn't seem to realize there's been a new deal over here. This was a criticism of Monnet's close friends with Dulles and the Republican firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, with whom Monnet had worked. Moreover, Morgenthau told Bullitt that before the US government showed Monnet our most secret of secrets regarding advanced plane equipment, Bullitt would have to show us he's got the money. Monnet offered to, but what is so interesting is that Monnet offered to put up part or all of the $250,000 needed to capitalize on the proposed aircraft construction, which would be independent of the French government for legal reasons. The Canadian scheme had been designed, Monnet said, quote, with the main intention of protecting any cooperation that was given to us by your people. In January 16th, 1939, FDR called the Treasury, Navy, and war officials to the White House and demanded immediate assistance to the French. The military resisted, of course, but of course Roosevelt had to be obeyed, and the French Purchasing Commission that was composed of, interestingly enough, René Plevin and René Mayer, who represented armaments industry in Paris, signed contracts in mid-February for, at that moment, for 555 combat planes and trainers, and another 1,000 in 1940. while the orders were delayed by production problems and the test flight, which ended in tragedy, the French had fewer than 200 American planes in time in France when the war broke out in '39. But President Roosevelt understood what the French orders meant to American production, to American aircraft production. They benefited the Allies by quadrupling American monthly production capacity in less than a year. And this, of course, laid the groundwork for a rapid expansion of America's aircraft industry at a later date. This was very important for the Americans. Now, I want to speak very briefly about 5 initiatives that lay the groundwork for his work in 1941. And they are all either initiated by him or stimulated by him and carried out by the prime ministers and the American president. The first of all was the Anglo-French Coordinating Committee, which Monnet believed that the French and the British had to work together to provide economic planning and strengthen the war Allied effort, because he believed that the only way to win the war, like the First World War, as he quote, to pool the two countries' material resources and productive capacity. Now, Monnet went to London and made himself chair of this committee and worked very hard on coordinating supplies. So the second initiative was the Anglo-French Purchasing Commission in Washington, where, stimulated by Monnet, Chamberlain accepted Daladier's proposal, urged upon him by Monnet in the second memo for a joint Anglo-French Purchasing Commission to coordinate supplies to the French and the British. And an interesting quote from Morgenthau's diaries, when he knew it was a good idea because coordination was very important. But he said, and I quote, he worried about the appointment of Monnet as head of this purchasing commission coming to Washington. And he said, well, I'm not crazy, and I quote, I'm not crazy about Monnet coming over here, he said to Sumner Welles. I suppose I get along with him as well as I can with any other Frenchman. But heaven only knows where all his connections are. So this continually idea was brought up. And, but Morgenthau's worry disappeared when Monnet was made chairman of the Anglo-French Coordinating Committee in London, and Arthur Purvis, a Canadian businessman, was named head of the purchasing mission in New York. Now, Morgenthau's positive relationship with Purvis facilitated U.S. material aid to the Allies and was a powerful counterweight. So Morgenthau got on with the British representative, and it wasn't necessary for him necessarily to get on very well with Monnet. Now, the third initiative was Monnet made sure that the British orders, Britain joined in the French orders for American aircraft once the Germans started rolling in, advancing in Europe. And this achievement was very important so that Monnet would not lose, the French would not lose their orders for U.S. aircraft. So that was a very important move, which was very successful. Just happened in time. Now, the fourth initiative was when Monnet took the initiative to telegram Purvis on the 17th of June, once the Germans had were overrunning France, to divert all future U.S. orders for supplies, not just airplanes, intended for France to the UK, so that none of this production, or none of these negotiations were lost. So this was extremely important and astute of Monnet, typical and very astute. Now, the last initiative, the fifth initiative that I talk about, it was placed him in Washington in 1940 and 1941 at a critical time. And typical of Monnet, after submitting his resignation as head of the Anglo-French Coordinating Committee to Pétain in July 1940, he went to Churchill and offered his services and said, I would like to serve the true interests of your country and mine. And by continuing his work on supply coordination, which he'd done in London, Churchill agreed for him to go to be a member of the British Purchasing Commission, working with Purvis in New York and Washington. And this, he gave him a passport signed by himself and a salary of $10,000 a year drawn on the Ministry of Supply. As a result, Monnet had succeeded in placing himself back in Washington, where he felt he could make the most difference, at a time when he moved easily again among the networks of individuals who had influence at the White House. And Monnet, as you know, always had this ability to discover who would be helpful. It was also a time when he could most effectively influence American production of supplies and armaments to the Allies, because he'd been supervising the British Purchasing Commission in London. And therefore, it was invaluable. And and he was also very familiar, because of his close American friends, with the American decision-making process. And he knew that President Roosevelt was the final decision maker. And so he and Purvis were a great team. Even though Morgenthau preferred Purvis and worked with Purvis, Monnet and Purvis worked together. And this was a very effective teamwork. Now, once back in Washington, Monnet met another very close advisor of Roosevelt's through the Chief Justice Felix Frankfurter. And this man was called Harry Hopkins, who was one of President Roosevelt's closest allies and closest advisors. And Monnet and Hopkins got along very well initially, after some difficulty. But in March of '41, Hopkins was put in charge of arms aid to the Allies. So Morgenthau was no longer the key person. And from then on, when the British had a problem with the Americans, they briefed Monnet and sent him to see Hopkins, a practice which produced solutions. And another influential link with the President Roosevelt was renewed when Henry Stimson was made Secretary of War by Roosevelt. And Stimson had a close relationship with Roosevelt, but it was somebody Monnet had already known in the 30s when Stimson was in the Hoover administration. So he had another ally working with him and another connection to the White House. And when Stimson appointed John J. McCloy, this brilliant young lawyer that he had met in the 20s, and became another personal friend. And so Monnet had friends and special connections in several places. So McCloy was very helpful as well to Monnet and to in this whole situation. And they worked together with John McCloy and Hopkins, and Stimson worked together to solve problems of mobilizing the U.S. industrial power. Now, Monnet's work with Nathan and May, Robert Nathan, the economist, and Stacey May, the economic statistician, were people that were placed in the key position in the United States at that particular moment in time. And this Monnet worked with them at this moment, and part of his genius, as you all know, was that he could identify individuals at all levels who could be useful to him. And he sought out Nathan, and they became very, very close. And this uncanny sense of who had influence and power drove him to seek out these kinds of people. And he and Nathan went on walks together. They had dinners together. Nathan was invited to his home, and they were dined by Sylvia, and et cetera. So this was a very important connection at a strategic moment in time. Now, their job of Nathan and Stacy May was to collect information on military requirements, analyze the productive capacity of the economy, and to determine the critical components that were needed, with special emphasis on raw materials, machinery, and equipment that would be needed if an all-out defense mobilization became necessary. So I was privileged to interview Nathan on a number of occasions, and Nathan became very, very fond, of course, of Jean Monnet and great friends. And Nathan quoted, he really enjoyed Monnet. They argued. He really disliked sometimes his brusque style, and Monnet always came back with a counter, and why don't you increase production of this, and why not that? And Nathan was saying, look, we can only do what is feasible. It doesn't do us any good to miscalculate our statistics. And so throughout 1941, Monnet met regularly with Stacy May and with Nathan, and to discuss the problems of the Allies. And Nathan said Monnet gradually became indispensable in helping to coordinate British and US efforts to match British needs against American capabilities. And Nathan declared Monnet had attacked the heart of the problem, how to get the British quantities of airplanes, tanks, and ammunition that they needed that the United States could produce. And their effort was to match US strategy against national resources and capabilities. But determining military requirements was very difficult. No military branch, Army, Navy, wanted to give away any information, and certainly they didn't want to share it with the British. Now, what is fascinating, since there was very little, it was very difficult to get military information from the Americans. Stacy May said to his own committee, you predict them, you invent them, you write them down, and we'll go to the British. And the Stacy May was sent to the British in August and September of 1941. Stacy May tried to drag them out of the British, and they created what is called the Anglo-American Consolidated Statement or Balance Sheet, another Monnet technique, which was completed in September of 1941. And the Consolidated Statement clearly demonstrated the limits of US production and US armament by showing how US production lagged behind Britain and Canada, despite the industrial capacity of America 4 times as large. So we have, to conclude here, Nathan's comment was, never have I worked with anyone who had a greater sense of management and maneuver than Monnet. He was truly a great strategist and was always full of ideas. And so Nathan really admired Monnet, worked with him, used his talents, and Nathan credits Monnet with being one of the most important single contributors to the Allied victory in World War II. And Nathan says, if it hadn't been for Monnet and the victory program effort, we would have lost months of production. And he said, Monnet provided the leadership, and I quote, the leadership for setting higher goals for American armament production. Now, I would like to conclude with 3 points. Monnet's relationship with Roosevelt, and I describe it as complex, productive, workable, but above all distant. And I interviewed our American historian named Robert Dallek, who is the most respected authority on Roosevelt's foreign policy. And I ran these words behind, I said, what do you think, Bob, of these descriptive characteristics of the relationship between Roosevelt and Monnet? And he said, they're right, but above all distant. Secondly, Monnet's most important contribution to the victory program was made in 1941 during his work with May and Nathan. And thirdly, my belief is that Monnet was not an economist, but one who had an instinct about the economy. And above all, in the words of Jean-Claude Casanova, Monnet was a pragmatic visionary whose pragmatism was a defining asset. Thank you.